Penelope Ashworth woke on the morning of May 3rd, 1849, to the sound of rain against the windows of Ashworth Manor and the quiet rustling of servants moving through the corridors, with the careful efficiency that came from executing plans they'd been rehearsing for weeks. Today was her wedding day, the culmination of 22 years of preparation for a role that had been assigned to her before she'd drawn her first breath, before she'd had any say in the trajectory her life would take, or the person she would become in service of an arrangement made by men who valued alliances more than they valued the actual human beings, whose futures they were trading like shares on the stock exchange. She lay still for a moment, watching grey light filter through the heavy curtains, and listening to the muffled sounds of the household preparing for the grandest social event the Ashworth family had hosted in a generation, and she tried to summon the excitement or joy, or at least the nervous anticipation that brides were supposed to feel on their wedding morning. Instead, she felt only a strange, hollow numbness, as if she were watching herself from a distance, observing the final act of a play that had been scripted long before the actors had any awareness they were performing roles rather than living authentic lives. The arrangement had been made when Penelope's mother was still pregnant, with Viscount Ashworth and the old Duke of Thornhill meeting over brandy and cigars to negotiate the future marriage between their as-yet unborn children, binding together two families whose fortunes had been declining for different reasons, and who saw strategic alliance as the solution to problems that probably required less dramatic intervention. When Penelope had been born a girl rather than the hoped-for heir, and when the Duchess of Thornhill had subsequently delivered a healthy son named Marcus, the contract had been formalized with legal precision that left no room for either party to reconsider or renegotiate once the children reached marriageable age. Penelope had been raised knowing exactly what her future held. She would marry Marcus Blackwood, become Duchess of Thornhill, provide heirs to secure the succession, and manage the social and domestic aspects of the dukedom with grace and competence that would reflect well on both families and justify the alliance that her father valued so highly. She'd been educated accordingly, tutored in French and Italian and German, trained in music and drawing and all the accomplishments expected of a duchess, drilled in etiquette and household management and the subtle arts of social navigation that would allow her to maintain her position and her dignity, regardless of what challenges marriage and aristocratic life might present. And through it all, through 22 years of preparation and anticipation, Penelope had accepted her fate with the dutiful resignation that seemed appropriate for someone whose life had never really belonged to her in the first place. She had met Marcus perhaps a dozen times over the years at carefully orchestrated encounters designed to allow the betrothed pair to become acquainted without developing expectations or attachments that might complicate the purely practical nature of their arrangement. He had been polite but distant during these meetings, treating Penelope with the formal courtesy one might extend to a business associate rather than a future wife, and she had responded with equal reserve, neither of them apparently inclined to pretend that romantic feelings played any role in their approaching marriage. But somewhere during the final year of their engagement, as the wedding date grew closer and the reality of spending her entire life bound to this man became increasingly concrete rather than abstract, Penelope had found herself developing something that felt uncomfortably close to genuine affection for Marcus, despite the practical foundations of their match. She had convinced herself that his reserve masked deeper feelings he was simply too well bred to express openly, that his careful courtesy represented respect that might blossom into tenderness once they were actually married and living together, rather than meeting under the watchful eyes of chaperones and family members. She had built elaborate fantasies about their future together, imagining conversations they might have and small intimacies they might share, and the gradual development of partnership that would make their arranged marriage into something resembling the love matches she'd read about in novels she probably shouldn't have been reading. A soft knock interrupted her reverie, and her maid Martha entered, carrying a breakfast tray that Penelope knew she wouldn't be able to eat, despite the long day ahead, that would require energy and stamina she wasn't certain she possessed. "Good morning, Miss Penelope," Martha said with the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested she was trying to project enthusiasm she didn't necessarily feel. "Your wedding day at last. I can hardly believe our little girl is to be a duchess before the sun sets tonight." Martha had been with the family since Penelope was born, serving first as nursemaid and then transitioning into the role of lady's maid as Penelope grew older. And she was one of the few people who seemed to genuinely care about Penelope's happiness, rather than simply viewing her as a strategic asset to be deployed for family advancement. "I'm not certain I can believe it either," Penelope admitted, sitting up and accepting the tea Martha poured with practiced efficiency. "It all feels rather unreal, as though it's happening to someone else, and I'm simply observing from a distance." "Wedding day nerves," Martha said firmly, though her eyes held concern that suggested she saw through Penelope's careful composure to the uncertainty beneath. "Perfectly natural, miss. Every bride feels the same way on her wedding morning, wondering if she's making the right choice, and whether she'll be happy, and all manner of questions that seem overwhelming until the ceremony is done, and she realizes that marriage is simply the beginning of a new chapter, rather than the ending of everything that came before." Penelope nodded but didn't respond, because how could she explain that her nervousness stemmed not from normal bridal anxiety, but from the growing recognition that she'd spent 22 years preparing to marry a man she didn't actually know, and who had given no indication that he had any interest in knowing her beyond the superficial acquaintance necessary to fulfill their contracted obligation. How could she articulate the creeping fear that she'd convinced herself to feel affection for Marcus, because accepting that she felt nothing would make the prospect of spending her entire life bound to him completely unbearable? The morning passed in a blur of preparation, bathing in rose-scented water, sitting still while Martha arranged her hair in the elaborate style that had taken weeks to perfect, stepping carefully into the wedding gown that had been commissioned from London's finest modiste, and which transformed Penelope into a vision of bridal perfection that bore little resemblance to the uncertain young woman she felt like beneath the silk and lace. The dress was magnificent, she had to admit. Ivory silk with delicate embroidery and silver thread, and a train so long it would require 2 attendants to manage. And when she finally stood before the mirror to assess the full effect, she saw a duchess looking back at her, poised and elegant, and exactly what Marcus and both their families expected her to be. "You look beautiful, miss," Martha whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "A proper duchess, just as you were meant to be." Penelope studied her reflection, searching for some sign of the person she might have been if her life hadn't been predetermined before her birth, if she'd been allowed to develop preferences and make choices and discover who she actually was rather than who she'd been trained to become. But that girl, if she'd ever existed at all, had been so thoroughly submerged beneath layers of duty and expectation that Penelope couldn't locate her anymore, couldn't remember what it felt like to want something simply because she wanted it, rather than because wanting it served some larger strategic purpose. The journey to Thornhill Chapel took perhaps 20 minutes, the carriage rolling through the Thornhill estate with its manicured grounds and carefully maintained architecture that spoke to centuries of wealth and careful stewardship. Penelope sat beside her father, who had said remarkably little to her all morning, beyond expressing satisfaction that the weather had cleared enough to allow the ceremony to proceed, without rain dampening the guests' arrival or creating logistical complications with the outdoor elements of the celebration. "You understand the importance of today," he said finally, as the chapel came into view, its ancient stone walls draped with flowers and ribbons in the Thornhill colours. "This alliance secures our family's future, Penelope. The Ashworth name will be linked to one of England's oldest and most respected titles, and your children will inherit both our legacy and the Thornhill estates. You've been prepared for this role since before you were born, and I expect you to fulfill your obligations with the grace and dignity that reflects well on the family that raised you." "Yes, father," Penelope replied automatically, the response so practiced it required no conscious thought, and she wondered distantly whether he had any concept of her as a person rather than simply as a strategic asset he'd been cultivating for disposal at the optimal moment. She wondered whether it had ever occurred to him to ask if she wanted this marriage, if she loved Marcus, or even liked him particularly, if she had dreams or desires that existed independently of the role she'd been assigned. But of course he hadn't asked, because asking would have suggested that her preferences mattered, that she had agency in determining her own future, and acknowledging such possibilities would have undermined the fundamental premise on which her entire existence had been constructed. The chapel was filled to capacity when they arrived. England's elite assembled to witness the union of two prominent families and to be seen witnessing it, their attendance serving multiple purposes related to social positioning and alliance signalling that had nothing to do with celebrating Penelope's happiness or Marcus's choice. She recognized the Duke of Wellington near the front, several cabinet ministers scattered throughout the pews, distant cousins of the royal family occupying places of honor, all of them dressed in their finest and wearing expressions of polite interest that would transform into eager gossip the moment the ceremony concluded, and they could begin analyzing every detail for significance and scandal. Her younger sister Vivian sat in the family section, looking ethereal in pale pink silk, her blonde hair arranged in careful curls that framed her face with calculated artlessness. And when their eyes met, Vivian offered a small smile that Penelope couldn't quite interpret. Was it supportive? Envious? Something else entirely that Penelope's nervousness prevented her from reading accurately. At 18, Vivian possessed the kind of fresh beauty and natural vivacity that drew attention effortlessly, and Penelope had sometimes wondered whether their father regretted that the marriage contract specified his eldest daughter, rather than allowing him to substitute the younger, prettier sister, once it became clear that Vivienne would be the family beauty, while Penelope would be merely acceptable. The music swelled, and Penelope began her walk down the aisle on her father's arm, each step bringing her closer to the altar where Marcus waited and to the future that had been inevitable since before she could remember. She kept her eyes forward, her posture perfect, her expression composed into the serene mask she'd been practicing for weeks, and she tried not to think about the fact that she was about to bind herself for life to a man who looked at her with all the warmth and enthusiasm one might direct at a particularly tedious business obligation. Marcus stood at the altar in his formal attire, looking every inch the Duke he was, tall and handsome in a classical way, his dark hair perfectly arranged, his expression distant and unreadable as he watched her approach. Penelope searched his face for some sign of emotion, some hint that he felt anything beyond dutiful acceptance of a contractual obligation, but found only the same cool reserve he'd displayed during all their previous encounters, and she felt something cold settling in her chest at the recognition that this was what her future held. Decades of polite distance from a husband who had never wanted her and who had simply accepted her because refusing would have created complications he preferred to avoid. She reached the altar, and her father transferred her hand to Marcus's with formal solemnity, the gesture symbolic of property-changing ownership, rather than anything resembling genuine connection or mutual choice, and Penelope felt the weight of her life settling onto her shoulders with crushing finality. The vicar began speaking in the traditional cadences of the marriage ceremony, his voice resonating through the chapel with practiced authority, and Penelope fixed her gaze on Marcus's face while trying to regulate her breathing and maintain her composure through the final moments before she became irrevocably bound to a future she'd never chosen. But then Marcus did something completely unexpected. Instead of responding to the vicar's questions with the anticipated affirmative, he stepped back slightly, releasing Penelope's hand and turning to address the assembled guests with clear determination that suggested whatever he was about to say had been carefully planned rather than arising from sudden impulse. "I apologize for the dramatic nature of this interruption," he said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent chapel. but I find I cannot proceed with this union in good conscience." The words seemed to echo in the vast space, each syllable landing with physical force that made Penelope's vision swim and her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. She stood frozen at the altar in her magnificent wedding gown, her hand still extended in the space where Marcus's had been moments before, and she tried to process what was happening, even as her mind rejected the information as impossible, because this couldn't be happening, couldn't be real, had to be some nightmare from which she would wake to find the wedding proceeding normally. "Your Grace," the vicar stammered, clearly as shocked as everyone else by this unprecedented violation of ceremony and decorum. "Surely you cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what I've said," Marcus interrupted, his tone allowing no room for argument or negotiation. "This arrangement was made without consulting my preferences or considering my desires, and I've allowed it to proceed this far, only because I lacked the courage to speak my truth earlier. But standing here now, about to bind myself for life to a woman I neither love nor desire to spend my days with, I find I cannot take vows I have no intention of honouring with sincerity or genuine commitment." Penelope heard gasps rippling through the assembled guests and felt hundreds of eyes fixed on her with avid fascination, people witnessing her humiliation and already composing the gossip they would spread throughout London before the sun set on this cursed day. She wanted to run, to disappear, to cease existing entirely, rather than continue standing at this altar being publicly rejected by the man she'd been promised to since before her birth. But her training held her immobile with her head high and her expression carefully neutral, even as everything inside her shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. "Then whom do you propose to marry?" Viscount Ashworth demanded, his face flushed with fury as he strode toward the altar with clear intent to force the ceremony to proceed through sheer determination if necessary. "You're contractually obligated to marry my daughter Thornhill, and the law—" "The law cannot compel affection," Marcus cut in smoothly, and Penelope noticed for the first time that he was looking past her toward the pews where Vivian sat, with her eyes wide and her face pale, with what appeared to be genuine shock rather than guilty knowledge. "And I've discovered that my affection has fixed itself on someone else entirely, someone who possesses the youth and vivacity and genuine warmth that your eldest daughter, through no fault of her own, seems to lack through years of being trained for duty rather than cultivated for authentic human connection." He moved past Penelope as though she were merely an obstacle to be navigated rather than a person whose entire life he was destroying with this public rejection, and he stopped before Vivian with his hand extended in clear invitation. "Miss Vivian Ashworth," he said, with more warmth than Penelope had ever heard in his voice during any of their interactions, "would you do me the honour of becoming my wife? I realise this is unconventional, and that I should have approached your father properly, rather than making such a declaration in this manner. But circumstances have forced my hand, and I find I cannot continue pretending feelings I do not possess, when my heart has declared itself so clearly in your favour." Vivian looked absolutely stricken, her gaze darting between Marcus and Penelope with obvious distress that suggested she'd had no advance knowledge of this plan and no desire to participate in her sister's public humiliation. "Your Grace, this is—" she stammered, clearly searching for words adequate to the impossible situation. "My sister, the contract. I cannot possibly—" "The contract specified an Ashworth daughter," Marcus said, with the kind of legal precision that suggested he'd consulted solicitors about the exact wording and identified a loophole that would allow him to substitute one sister for another without technically violating the terms. It did not specify which daughter, and while I acknowledge the assumption that the eldest would be the bride, I see nothing in the legal language that would prevent me from fulfilling my obligation to the letter, if not the spirit, by choosing the younger Miss Ashworth instead. Penelope heard these words as if from a great distance, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. Not only was she being rejected at the altar in front of everyone who mattered in English society, but she was being rejected in favour of her younger sister. The comparison between them made brutally explicit for hundreds of witnesses who would spend years dissecting every detail of this catastrophe. She looked at Vivian and saw genuine horror in her sister's expression, saw tears gathering in her eyes and her hands trembling as she shook her head in clear refusal of Marcus's proposal. "No," Vivian said, her voice stronger now, and Penelope felt a flash of gratitude for her sister's loyalty, even as she recognized that refusing wouldn't change anything fundamental about the situation. "I won't participate in this cruelty, Your Grace. My sister has been preparing for this marriage her entire life, and I won't be the instrument of her humiliation regardless of what feelings you claim to have developed. If you cannot marry Penelope with honor and genuine commitment, then you should not marry at all, rather than using me as a replacement simply because you've decided you prefer youth to maturity or vivacity to the dignity that comes from years of careful preparation for exactly the role you claim you no longer want her to fulfill." Marcus's expression hardened at this rejection, his pride clearly wounded by Vivienne's refusal to cooperate with his plan, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of cruelty that made Penelope understand with sudden clarity that she'd been fortunate to escape binding herself to someone capable of such calculated malice. "Then I shall find another bride," he said coldly, turning back to address Viscount Ashworth directly. "I'll pay double the contracted dowry as compensation for the inconvenience and the social embarrassment, and I'll ensure that appropriate financial arrangements are made to minimize the impact on your family's standing. But I will not marry Miss Penelope Ashworth, not today and not ever, and no amount of legal pressure or social expectation will compel me to proceed with a union I find fundamentally incompatible with my desires and my vision for my future." The chapel had descended into chaos, voices rising in shocked speculation and scandalized judgment, people standing and craning for better views of the drama unfolding at the altar, and through it all, Penelope remained frozen in her wedding gown, with her world crumbling around her, and her mind strangely detached from the emotional devastation that she knew would hit her fully once the initial shock wore. She heard her father shouting about contracts and consequences, heard the vicar attempting to restore order, heard the rising tide of gossip that would define her for the rest of her life, as the woman so inadequate that her groom had rejected her at the altar in favor of her prettier younger sister. And then, with movements so controlled they felt almost mechanical, Penelope reached up and removed the pearl necklace that Marcus had given her that morning, as the traditional groom's gift to his bride, the delicate strand that she'd fastened around her throat with trembling fingers, while imagining it as a symbol of the new life beginning today. She held it out to Marcus with steady hands that betrayed none of the turmoil churning inside her. "You'll want to save this for your chosen bride, Your Grace," she said, her voice emerging with remarkable clarity and composure that surprised even her. "Whoever she may be, since my sister has demonstrated better judgment than you credited her with by refusing to participate in this spectacle, I hope you find someone who meets your exacting standards for youth and vivacity, and I hope she brings you all the happiness that I apparently would have failed to provide through my unfortunate tendency toward dignity and careful preparation for responsibilities that you've now made clear you never intended to share with someone like me." "Tai," she placed the necklace in his hand and turned to face Vivian, who was crying openly now with her face buried in her hands, and Penelope felt her heart breaking for her sister's distress, even as she recognized that Vivian bore no blame for Marcus's choices or his cruelty. "Don't cry for me," she said gently, reaching out to touch Vivian's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong, and I don't hold you responsible for his decisions or his preferences. Take care of yourself, Viv, and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for being young and beautiful and everything I apparently failed to be." Then, before her composure could crack entirely, Penelope turned and walked back down the aisle she'd processed up with such hope mere minutes ago, her head held high and her steps measured, despite the fact that every eye in the chapel was fixed on her with avid fascination or pitying sympathy. She heard the whispers starting already. "Poor thing, humiliated. What will she do now? Who will ever want her after this?" and she forced herself to keep walking, to maintain her dignity through sheer force of will, even though everything inside her was screaming to run, to hide, to cease existing rather than continue living as the object of such spectacular public rejection. Martha was waiting outside the chapel with the carriage, her face wet with tears, and her hands reaching immediately for Penelope, with the kind of unconditional support that made something crack in Penelope's carefully maintained control. "Oh, miss," she whispered, helping Penelope into the carriage with gentle hands that guided her around the train of the wedding dress that would never fulfill its intended purpose. "Oh, my dear girl, I'm so sorry, so very sorry." "Don't," Penelope managed, her voice breaking on the single word. "Please don't be kind to me right now, Martha. I can't. I'll shatter if anyone is kind." "Where shall I tell the driver to go?" Martha asked, practical even in crisis, and Penelope realized with sudden clarity that she couldn't return to Ashworth Manor, couldn't face her father's fury, or endure his recriminations about failing to secure the alliance that had been the sole purpose of her existence, couldn't survive his coldness or his calculations about how to salvage the family's social standing from the wreckage of her humiliation. "Aunt Cordelia's townhouse," she said, thinking of her father's sister, who had never married, and who lived independently in London, with a fortune inherited from their grandmother, and a reputation for eccentricity that had always seemed more like freedom when Penelope encountered it during rare visits. "Take me to Warwick House. She'll take me in, I think. She has to." The journey to London passed in a blur of tears and shock, Penelope's composure finally cracking once they were safely away from the chapel and the witnesses to her devastation. Martha held her while she sobbed, offering wordless comfort and practical handkerchiefs, and not trying to minimize the catastrophe or offer false reassurances that everything would somehow be fine, when they both knew that nothing would ever be fine again, that Penelope's life as she'd known it had ended the moment Marcus had stepped away from her at the altar and declared her inadequate for his purposes. By the time they reached Warwick House, it was late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent and London's streets bustling with the ordinary activities of people whose lives hadn't imploded spectacularly that morning, and Penelope felt disconnected from all of it, as though she existed in a separate reality where catastrophe was the only constant and nothing would ever be ordinary or simple again. Martha helped her from the carriage and supported her up the steps to Aunt Cordelia's door, and when the butler opened it and took in the sight of Penelope in her wedding gown with tear-stained cheeks and obvious distress, his professional composure slipped just enough to reveal genuine concern. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and then corrected himself with the kind of tact that suggested he'd already heard news of the day's events through the servant networks that moved information faster than any official channels. "Forgive me, Miss Penelope. Lady Cordelia is in her study." "Shall I announce that you're here?" "No need, Henderson," came Aunt Cordelia's voice from the hallway, and Penelope looked up to see her aunt approaching with quick strides and an expression that combined fury and fierce protectiveness in equal measure. "I heard what happened. Half of London has heard by now, the gossip travelling faster than the principles of any of the people spreading it. Come inside, child. You're safe here." Cordelia Warwick was 53 years old and had never married, despite possessing both beauty and fortune, enough to have secured any number of proposals during her youth, choosing instead to maintain her independence and spend her life pursuing intellectual interests and charitable work that fulfilled her far more than marriage to any of the men who had sought her hand. She'd been viewed as eccentric by the family, pitied by some relatives and resented by others who felt her unmarried status reflected poorly on the Ashworth name. But Penelope had always found her fascinating and admirable in ways she'd never quite articulated even to herself. Now, standing in Aunt Cordelia's elegant foyer in her ruined wedding gown, Penelope felt something inside her break completely, and she found herself sobbing again, while her aunt wrapped strong arms around her and held her with the kind of fierce tenderness that Penelope hadn't experienced since her mother had died when she was 12. "There now," Cordelia murmured. Let it out, all of it. You're entitled to tears and rage and whatever else you need to feel. That opportunistic blackguard doesn't deserve a moment of your grief, but you're human and you're hurt and you have every right to feel devastated by his cruelty. She guided Penelope upstairs to a guest room that was beautifully appointed with soft furnishings and warm colours that felt immediately welcoming, and she helped Penelope out of the wedding dress with Martha's assistance, the three of them working together to free her from the silk and lace that had been meant to mark the beginning of her new life, but which now felt like a shroud for everything she'd lost. Cordelia produced a simple day dress in deep blue that Penelope changed into with mechanical efficiency, and then her aunt sat her down with tea and honey cakes and waited patiently while Penelope tried to gather herself enough to speak coherently. "I don't understand what happened," Penelope finally managed, wrapping her hands around the teacup for warmth, even though the room wasn't cold. "I know Marcus never loved me, but I thought he accepted our arrangement, thought he understood the alliance served both our interests. Why would he wait until we were literally at the altar to reject me? Why make such a public spectacle rather than ending things privately weeks ago if he'd developed feelings for Vivian, or simply decided he couldn't proceed with our marriage?" Cordelia's expression hardened. "Because he's a coward and a bully who wanted to ensure you were maximally humiliated rather than simply ending the engagement like a gentleman. He wanted everyone to see him rejecting you, wanted to make it clear that he found you wanting, wanted to demonstrate his power by destroying you publicly rather than privately. It's the act of a small man, Penelope, regardless of his title or his position. A real man, a good man, would have spoken to you weeks ago if his feelings had changed, would have handled the situation with discretion and consideration for your dignity. What he did today was cruelty for its own sake. He called me lacking," Penelope whispered, the words Marcus had used cutting deeper than perhaps anything else about the situation. "Said I was trained for duty rather than cultivated for authentic human connection, that I didn't possess youth or vivacity or warmth. He's right, isn't he? I've spent 22 years becoming exactly what everyone expected me to be, and in the process, I've somehow failed to become a person anyone would actually want to spend their life with." "Stop," Cordelia said sharply, taking Penelope's hands in her own. "Stop accepting his assessment as truth when it's nothing but self-serving justification for his own terrible behavior. You are not lacking, Penelope. You're intelligent and dignified and capable, and the fact that you were raised to fulfill certain expectations doesn't make you any less human or worthy of love and respect. Marcus Blackwood is a fool who doesn't recognize value when it's standing directly in front of him, and his loss is profound even if he's too short-sighted to realize it." "But who will want me now?" Penelope asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since the moment Marcus had rejected her. "I'm 22 and publicly rejected at the altar, ruined by scandal that will follow me for the rest of my life. No respectable man will consider me after this. Not when the Duke of Thornhill himself declared me inadequate in front of half of England's aristocracy. I'll be pitied and whispered about and forever defined as the woman so flawed that even a contractual arrangement couldn't compel a man to follow through with marrying her." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive of Penelope's concerns, and when she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "I won't lie to you and say this won't affect your social standing or your marriage prospects, because it absolutely will. Society is cruel, and memory is long when it comes to scandals involving aristocratic families. But Penelope, my dear child, I want you to consider something that may not have occurred to you yet. Perhaps being unmarriageable by conventional standards is actually a gift rather than a curse. Perhaps it's an opportunity to discover who you actually are when you're not performing for someone else's expectations, or preparing yourself to fulfill a role that was assigned to you without your consent." "I don't understand," Penelope said, confused by this perspective that seemed to contradict everything she'd been taught about the importance of marriage and social position. "You've spent your entire life preparing to be the Duchess of Thornhill," Cordelia continued, settling back in her chair with the air of someone prepared to deliver a lecture she'd been rehearsing for years. Learning languages and accomplishments, studying etiquette and household management, cultivating the particular kind of dignity and composure that duchesses require. But did you ever stop to wonder what you might have become if you'd been free to pursue your own interests? What subjects might have fascinated you if you'd been allowed to study for pleasure rather than duty? What talents might have emerged if you'd been encouraged to develop authentic preferences rather than strategic competencies? Penelope stared at her aunt, these questions opening doors in her mind that she'd never even noticed were closed. I don't know, she admitted. I never thought about it. There was never any point in thinking about it because my future was already determined. Exactly, Cordelia said with satisfaction. But your future isn't determined anymore, is it? Marcus's cruelty has freed you from the contract that bound your entire existence. And while that freedom comes at a terrible price in terms of social embarrassment and damaged reputation, it's still freedom. You can stay here with me as long as you need to, Penelope, indefinitely, and during that time you can figure out who you actually are rather than who you were trained to be. You can read books that interest you rather than books that were assigned as educational requirements, can pursue studies that fascinate you rather than accomplishments deemed necessary for a duchess, can discover preferences and develop opinions and become a complete person rather than a carefully constructed performance designed to satisfy other people's expectations. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, offering possibilities Penelope had never imagined alongside the loss of everything she'd thought her life would contain. What if I discover I'm nothing? She asked quietly. What if there's no real person underneath all the training? Just an empty space where authentic preferences and genuine desires should have been. Cordelia smiled with surprising warmth. Then we'll fill that space together, and you'll build yourself into someone you actually want to be, rather than someone you were told you should become. But I don't think you're empty, Penelope. I think you've been suppressing yourself so thoroughly for so long that you've forgotten you exist beneath all those careful layers. And now you have the opportunity to remember, to excavate yourself from under years of other people's expectations and requirements. It won't be easy, and it won't happen quickly, but I promise you it will be worthwhile. That night, Penelope slept in the guest room that Cordelia had declared would be hers for as long as she needed it. And for the first time since the wedding day catastrophe, she found herself thinking about something other than Marcus's rejection and her own humiliation. She thought about Cordelia's questions regarding who she might have become if her life had been her own, and she realized with startling clarity that she had no idea how to answer those questions because she'd never been allowed to consider them relevant to her existence. She'd been shaped and molded and carefully constructed to fulfill a specific purpose. And now that purpose had been taken from her, she had no framework for understanding what remained or what she might build from the wreckage of her previous certainty. The following morning, Cordelia led her to the library, a magnificent two-story room filled with thousands of volumes accumulated over years of passionate collection, and she gestured broadly at the shelves surrounding them. Start here, she said simply. Read whatever catches your interest, not what you think you should read, or what might improve your mind or enhance your value as a potential wife. Just read for pleasure, for curiosity, for the simple joy of discovering ideas and stories that resonate with something inside you that has nothing to do with duty or obligation or strategic positioning. Penelope spent the next 3 weeks barely leaving the library, working her way through novels and philosophy and poetry with the kind of voracious hunger that surprised her with its intensity. She discovered that she loved Gothic fiction for its emotional extremity and its willingness to examine darkness that polite society preferred to ignore, found herself captivated by political philosophy that questioned the very social structures she'd been raised to uphold, responded to poetry that expressed feelings she hadn't known she possessed until seeing them articulated in someone else's words. And slowly, so gradually she barely noticed it happening, Penelope began to feel something shifting inside her, not healing exactly, because the wound of Marcus's rejection was still raw, and would probably remain tender for years, but perhaps the beginning of transformation from the person she'd been trained to be into someone she might actually choose to become, if given the opportunity. She still felt the sting of public humiliation whenever she thought about the chapel and the witnesses to her devastation, still woke some mornings with her heart racing from dreams where she was perpetually frozen at the altar while Marcus announced her inadequacy to an ever-expanding audience. But beneath the pain and embarrassment, something new was germinating. Curiosity about herself, interest in discovering what preferences and opinions might emerge once she stopped suppressing everything that didn't serve her assigned purpose. 4 weeks after the wedding day disaster, Cordelia announced at breakfast that they would be attending Lady Pembroke's literary salon that afternoon, and when Penelope immediately began to refuse, her aunt held up a hand to forestall the objection. "I know you'd prefer to remain hidden indefinitely," she said firmly, "but hiding only confirms every whisper that you've been broken by what happened, that Marcus's rejection destroyed you so completely that you're incapable of facing society. You need to appear in public, Penelope, not to prove anything to the people who are gossiping about you, but to prove to yourself that you survived this catastrophe and you're not going to allow it to define the rest of your existence." "I'm not ready," Penelope protested weakly, already knowing that Cordelia wouldn't accept this excuse. "You'll never be ready if you wait for readiness to arrive spontaneously," Cordelia replied. "Lady Pembroke's salon is small and intellectual rather than purely social. The guests more interested in discussing literature and ideas than in dissecting scandals. It's the perfect environment for your re-entry into society, among people who value minds more than they value conformity to social expectations. And I've made certain that the guest list includes several continental visitors who won't be familiar with your story and who will therefore treat you as a person rather than as a scandal to be examined." So, Penelope found herself that afternoon dressed in a gown of deep emerald that Cordelia had insisted would complement her colouring better than the pale shades she'd always worn to cultivate an image of demure suitability, and she stood in Lady Pembroke's elegant drawing room, trying not to notice the curious glances and whispered comments that followed her entrance, despite Cordelia's assurances that this gathering would be different from typical society events. She positioned herself near the windows with a teacup she had no intention of drinking, and tried to focus on the conversation happening nearby about Lord Byron's poetry, rather than on her own discomfort, and the persistent feeling that everyone was judging her and finding her wanting just as Marcus had. "You prefer Byron to Wordsworth," came a voice with a slight accent that Penelope couldn't immediately place, and she turned to find a tall man, perhaps in his early 30s, standing beside her with genuine interest in his dark eyes. "That's refreshing. Most English ladies I've encountered claim to admire Wordsworth's pastoral sensibilities, while secretly finding him rather tedious, but they rarely admit their true preferences in mixed company." Penelope found herself smiling slightly despite her nervousness. "I appreciate Wordsworth's skill," she admitted, "but I find Byron's emotional intensity more compelling, even when it veers into melodrama. There's something honest about his willingness to examine darkness and complexity, rather than retreating into celebrations of nature's simple beauty, as though acknowledging human messiness might contaminate the verse." The man's expression brightened with obvious pleasure at her response. "Exactly so. Byron understands that beauty and darkness often coexist, that human experience contains multitudes that cannot be adequately captured through pastoral imagery alone. Though I confess bias, having spent several years in Venice, where Byron lived during his exile, and finding the Italian appreciation for passionate intensity more congenial to my temperament than English restraint." "You're Italian?" Penelope asked, though the accent didn't quite match what she would have expected from someone native to Italy. "Austrian," he corrected with a slight bow. "Prince Sebastian Volkov, currently in England on diplomatic business, but happy to escape official duties for the more interesting society found in gatherings like this, where ideas matter more than title. Though I should probably introduce myself properly, rather than accosting you with opinions about romantic poetry." I'm afraid I saw you standing alone and couldn't resist approaching someone who appeared to share my appreciation for literary discussion over social pleasantries. Penelope Ashworth, she replied, waiting for the inevitable flash of recognition and the shift in his expression from interest to pity or curiosity about her scandal. But Prince Sebastian simply nodded, as though her name meant nothing to him, and Penelope realized with relief that Cordelia had been right about continental visitors being unlikely to know the details of her humiliation. "Miss Ashworth," he said warmly, "I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. Tell me, have you read Don Juan? I find Byron's finest work despite the scandal it caused. The way he uses humor and digression to examine serious themes while maintaining the reader's engagement through sheer narrative virtuosity." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing with surprising ease as they discussed literature and philosophy and the political situation on the continent, Prince Sebastian treating Penelope as an intellectual equal rather than as a decorative object or a scandal to be examined. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, pressing her to elaborate when she made interesting observations and offering his own perspectives with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he found their exchange genuinely stimulating rather than simply performing courtesy to a woman he'd been introduced to at a social gathering. "Your English is remarkable," Penelope observed. "I would never have guessed you weren't native to the language if you hadn't mentioned Vienna." "Yeah, my mother was English," Sebastian explained. "From Somerset, actually, though she died when I was quite young. But she insisted I learn her language fluently, and I've maintained the practice through extensive reading and travel. Languages fascinate me, the way they shape thought and expression, how different cultures conceptualize the same experiences through completely different linguistic frameworks." "Do you speak any other languages?" "French, Italian, and German," Penelope replied, then added with slight bitterness she couldn't quite suppress. "I was educated very thoroughly in accomplishments deemed appropriate for someone in my position. Languages, music, drawing, all the skills that make a woman suitable for managing a grand household and representing her husband's interests in social context that require continental sophistication." Something flickered in Sebastian's expression. Not pity exactly, but perhaps recognition of the resentment in her tone. "That sounds rather like training for a position rather than education for its own sake," he observed carefully. "Did you enjoy the learning itself, or only tolerate it as necessary preparation for your anticipated future?" The question caught Penelope off guard with its perceptiveness. I'm not certain I ever considered whether I enjoyed it," she admitted. "It was simply what was required, what I needed to know to fulfill my role. But now that you ask, I think I did enjoy languages specifically, the way learning them opened access to literature and ideas that wouldn't have been available to me otherwise, though I never thought about it at the time. Perhaps you might think about it that way now," Sebastian suggested gently. "Enjoy your linguistic skills for their own sake, rather than for what strategic purpose they might serve. Read French novels and Italian poetry simply because they interest you, not because consuming them makes you a more accomplished potential wife. Education for pleasure rather than duty is one of life's great satisfactions, I find." They were interrupted by Lady Pembroke, announcing that refreshments were available in the dining room, and as the gathering began to disperse, Sebastian bowed over Penelope's hand with old-world courtesy that felt charming rather than performative. "I've enjoyed our conversation immensely, Miss Ashworth," he said warmly. "I wonder if you might allow me to call on you at your residence. I'm planning to visit the British Museum tomorrow to view their collection of Greek antiquities, and I would be delighted to have a companion who appreciates intellectual discussion rather than simply viewing cultural artifacts as social props to be mentioned in conversation without genuine understanding or appreciation." Penelope glanced at Cordelia, who was watching from across the room with an expression of satisfaction that suggested this entire encounter had been orchestrated exactly as she'd hoped. Yes," Penelope heard herself say. surprising herself with the immediate acceptance. "I would enjoy that very much. I'm staying with my aunt, Lady Cordelia Warwick, at Warwick House in Mayfair. Would 2 o'clock be convenient?" "Perfectly convenient," Sebastian agreed. "I look forward to continuing our discussion, Miss Ashworth, and perhaps you might share your thoughts on the Elgin marbles controversy. I find the ethics of cultural appropriation fascinating, though I suspect my views may be considered radical by English standards that see imperial acquisition as a natural right rather than systematic theft." On the carriage ride home, Cordelia was practically radiating triumph. "Well," she demanded, "Prince Sebastian Volkov seemed quite taken with you. What did you think of him?" "He was interesting," Penelope admitted cautiously, "and he treated me like a person, rather than a scandal or a social obligation, which was refreshing. But surely he was simply being polite. I can't imagine a prince having genuine interest in someone like me, especially given my current social position." "Why not?" Cordelia challenged. "You're intelligent and well-educated and capable of engaging in substantive conversation about subjects that interest him." "Those are rare qualities, Penelope, rarer than beauty or youth or whatever superficial attributes Marcus claimed to prefer. Prince Sebastian values minds, and you have a first-rate mind that you're finally beginning to use for purposes beyond strategic positioning. Don't dismiss his interest as mere politeness when it might be genuine appreciation for qualities you possess that have nothing to do with your family connections or your suitability as a duchess." That night, Penelope slept without nightmares for the first time since the wedding day catastrophe, and when she woke the following morning, she found herself actually looking forward to the museum visit, rather than dreading social interaction or fearing judgment. She chose a walking dress in deep blue that Cordelia had commissioned for her, simpler than her previous wardrobe, but somehow more suited to who she was becoming, rather than who she'd been trained to be, and she arranged her hair in a style that felt less severe than her usual careful coiffure. The museum visit exceeded her expectations, Prince Sebastian proving to be both knowledgeable and genuinely enthusiastic about the artifacts they examined, his commentary revealing depths of scholarship that went far beyond what she would have expected from someone of his rank and position. They discussed the ethics of removing the Parthenon sculptures from Greece, debated the role of museums in preserving versus appropriating cultural heritage, and somehow found themselves talking about philosophy and politics and the changing social landscape of Europe as industrialization transformed traditional hierarchies and created new possibilities for how societies might organize themselves. "You're very well informed about political economy," Sebastian observed, as they paused before a particularly striking marble relief. "That's unusual for English ladies in my experience, who are typically educated to avoid such subjects as unsuitable for feminine interest. I've been reading extensively since—" Penelope stopped, not wanting to mention the wedding day disaster and inviting the pity or curiosity that would inevitably follow if Sebastian learned about her scandal. "Since," Sebastian prompted gently. "Since my circumstances changed rather dramatically," Penelope said carefully. "I found myself with unexpected freedom to pursue my own intellectual interests, rather than focusing exclusively on accomplishments deemed necessary for the role I'd been preparing to fill. It's been illuminating to discover what actually interests me when I'm not filtering everything through the question of whether it serves a strategic purpose." Sebastian studied her face with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable, but which also felt genuine rather than intrusive. "I sense there's a story there," he said quietly. "One you're not ready to share with someone you've only recently met. That's perfectly understandable, and I won't press you for details you're not comfortable providing. But Miss Ashworth, Penelope, if I may be so bold, I want you to know that whatever circumstances brought you to your current situation, I find you remarkable exactly as you are. Your intelligence, your curiosity, your willingness to engage with difficult ideas rather than retreating into comfortable certainties. These are rare qualities that I value highly, and I hope you'll allow me to continue our acquaintance regardless of whatever scandals or social complications might exist in your past." Penelope felt tears threatening and blinked them back firmly, surprised by the emotional impact of his words and the recognition that someone saw value in her that had nothing to do with her suitability for marriage or her potential to advance family alliances. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you probably realize." Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened through carefully chaperoned outings, walks in Kensington Gardens where they discussed Austrian politics and English social customs, visits to galleries where Sebastian's knowledge of art history expanded Penelope's understanding of aesthetic theory, afternoon teas where Cordelia joined them, and the conversation ranged freely over topics that would have been considered inappropriate for mixed company in more conventional social settings. And gradually, Penelope found herself thinking less about Marcus's rejection and more about the future she might build for herself, possibilities that were only beginning to emerge, but which felt increasingly real rather than merely theoretical. It was during one of their garden walks, perhaps 2 months after they'd first met, that Sebastian shared something of his own history that made Penelope understand his particular appreciation for seizing opportunities for happiness when they presented themselves. "My parents died when I was 16, he said quietly, as they paused near a fountain surrounded by early summer roses. "A carriage accident on a mountain road, sudden and devastating and completely unexpected. I inherited my title and my responsibilities years before I was prepared to manage them, and the experience taught me that life is fragile and unpredictable, that we cannot afford to postpone living authentically while waiting for some perfect future moment that may never arrive." "I'm so sorry," Penelope said, touching his arm gently. "That must have been terrifying, losing them both so suddenly and having such enormous responsibilities thrust upon you when you were barely more than a child." "It was," Sebastian agreed, "but it also freed me in certain ways, allowed me to shape my life according to my own values rather than conforming to expectations that might have constrained me if I'd had parents monitoring my choices and insisting I follow traditional paths. I've tried to use that freedom well, to pursue knowledge and experiences that matter to me, rather than simply performing the role of aristocrat without genuine engagement or authentic investment in the work." He turned to face her directly, taking her hand in his with a boldness that would have been shocking in more formal social contexts, but which felt natural in the privacy of the garden. "Penelope, I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you've experienced recent difficulties that have undoubtedly affected your ability to trust or to imagine positive romantic outcomes. But I find myself developing feelings for you that go beyond simple friendship or intellectual compatibility, and I wanted to express them honestly rather than hiding behind conventional courtship rituals that might obscure my true intentions." Penelope's heart was racing, hope and fear tangling together in her chest. "Sebastian, there are things you should know about my recent situation before you make any declarations you might later regret." "I know about the wedding," Sebastian said gently, and Penelope felt her stomach drop with the recognition that her scandal had reached even continental visitors who she'd believed might be ignorant of English society gossip. "Cordelia told me shortly after, wanting me to understand what you'd experienced and why you might be particularly vulnerable to romantic disappointment or social exploitation. She was protecting you, I think, ensuring I understood the responsibility I was taking on if I chose to pursue your acquaintance." "And you chose to pursue it anyway?" Penelope asked, searching his face for signs of pity or calculation. "I chose to pursue it because of who you are, not despite what happened to you," Sebastian replied firmly. "The Duke of Thornhill is a fool who failed to recognize your value, and his loss is profound even if he's too short-sighted to realize it. But Penelope, his failure of perception doesn't diminish your worth any more than my parents' death diminished my title or my responsibilities. You are remarkable, intelligent, thoughtful, increasingly willing to express genuine opinions rather than performing conventional femininity, and possessed of depths that I'm only beginning to discover. I would be honored if you would allow me to court you properly, with the understanding that I'm interested in you as you actually are, rather than as some idealized duchess figure you were trained to become. I'm ruined by scandal, Penelope protested, even as hope was beginning to bloom in her chest. No respectable Englishman would consider marrying me after being publicly rejected at the altar, and while I appreciate that you might feel differently as a continental visitor, surely your position requires you to consider political implications and family expectations that might make alliance with someone like me inadvisable or even impossible. My position requires me to marry eventually and produce heirs, Sebastian acknowledged. But it doesn't dictate whom I marry beyond requiring that she be of appropriate rank, which you are as the daughter of a viscount. The Austrian court cares little about English scandals, and my family, what remains of it, trusts my judgment about personal matters. More importantly, Penelope, I don't want to marry someone appropriate or strategic or perfectly positioned to advance my interests. I want to marry someone I can actually talk to, someone who challenges my thinking and shares my curiosity about the world, someone who sees me as a person rather than simply as a title to be acquired. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I know you need time to heal from what Marcus did to you, time to discover who you are when you're not performing for someone else's expectation. But I wanted you to know that I see value in you that goes far beyond whatever social calculations or family alliances might have motivated your previous engagement. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored to build a future with you based on genuine partnership and mutual respect rather than strategic positioning. Penelope felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time since the wedding day catastrophe, they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than devastation and shame. I don't know if I can believe this is real, she whispered. I spent so long thinking Marcus would eventually come to value me, convincing myself his reserve masked deeper feelings. And he rejected me so completely that I'm terrified of trusting my judgment about anyone's intentions or my ability to accurately assess whether someone actually cares for me. Then take all the time you need to develop that trust, Sebastian said simply. I'm not going anywhere, Penelope. I'll be here, continuing to value your mind and enjoy your company and demonstrating through consistent action, rather than words, that my interest in you is genuine and enduring. And if you ultimately decide you don't share my feelings or you're not ready for romantic attachment, I'll respect that decision, even as I'll be disappointed by it. The choice is yours, as it should have been from the beginning. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Warwick House bearing the Thornhill crest, and Penelope's hands trembled as she broke the seal and read the contents. It was from her mother, writing with the formal distance that had always characterized their relationship, requesting Penelope's attendance at the Countess of Harrington's annual grand ball that would be taking place in 2 weeks' time. The letter included the information that Marcus and his new wife would be making their first public appearance as a married couple at the event, and Penelope felt her stomach twist at the recognition that Marcus had indeed found a replacement bride willing to overlook his cruelty at the altar in favour of securing the Thornhill title. He married someone else, she said aloud, looking up from the letter to where Cordelia sat reading nearby. Just 3 months after rejecting me, Mother wants me to attend the Harrington ball, where he'll be appearing with his new Duchess. Cordelia set aside her book and regarded Penelope with serious attention. Do you want to go? No, Penelope admitted. Every instinct I have says to refuse, to stay hidden and avoid witnessing his happiness with someone else when I'm still healing from his rejection. But, Cordelia prompted. But I think I need to go, Penelope continued slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke them. I need to prove to myself that I can face him without falling apart, that his choices don't define my worth or determine my future. And I need to show everyone who witnessed my humiliation that I survived it, that I'm not the broken, devastated creature they probably imagine me to be. Cordelia smiled with obvious pride. Then you'll go, and you'll wear something magnificent that announces your transformation from dutiful daughter into independent woman. And you'll dance with Prince Sebastian, who I happen to know received an invitation to the same ball, and who will undoubtedly be delighted to serve as your escort for the evening. The 2 weeks before the ball passed in a flurry of preparation. A new gown commissioned in deep crimson silk that was bolder than anything Penelope had worn before. New jewellery selected to complement the dress rather than to signal appropriate demure femininity. And hours spent with Cordelia practicing the kind of confident carriage and direct eye contact that would signal strength rather than devastation when Penelope inevitably encountered Marcus and his new wife. Sebastian called the day before the ball, finding Penelope in the library where she'd been attempting to distract herself from anxiety by rereading favourite novels. "I understand we'll be seeing each other tomorrow evening," he said with a warm smile. "I'm honoured to serve as your escort if you'll have me, though I confess I'm also apprehensive about the emotional toll this event might take on you given the circumstances." "I'm terrified," Penelope admitted honestly, because she'd learned over the past months that Sebastian valued honesty more than he valued conventional feminine performance of confidence she didn't feel. Terrified of seeing Marcus with his new wife. Terrified of all the people who watched him reject me now watching to see how I react to his happiness with someone else. Terrified that I'll prove unable to maintain my composure and will humiliate myself all over again through some emotional collapse that confirms everyone's worst assumptions about my fragility. Sebastian took her hands in his expression serious but confident. "You won't collapse," he said firmly. "You're far stronger than you give yourself credit for, Penelope. You've survived a devastating public rejection, and you've used the experience to transform yourself from someone performing a role into someone discovering authentic selfhood. That's not the trajectory of a fragile person. That's evidence of remarkable resilience and courage." "What if he's happy?" Penelope asked quietly. "What if his new wife gives him everything I apparently couldn't provide, and seeing them together makes me realize that he was right to reject me because I truly was inadequate for what he needed?" "Then you'll know with certainty that you're better off without him," Sebastian replied. "Because any man who finds you inadequate is revealing his own limited capacity for recognizing value rather than identifying any actual deficiency in you. You deserve someone who sees your intelligence and your strength and your increasing willingness to express genuine opinions, someone who values those qualities rather than wanting you to suppress them in favor of decorative compliance." "And Penelope," he hesitated, then continued with obvious sincerity, "I hope you'll eventually believe that I'm that someone, that I see in you everything Marcus was too blind to appreciate, and that I would be honored to build a future with you if you're willing to trust me with that opportunity." The night of the ball arrived with shocking speed, despite Penelope's attempts to slow time through sheer force of will, and she stood before the mirror in her crimson gown, examining her reflection with a mixture of pride and terror. She looked different than she had on her wedding day, not just in the obvious ways of different dress and different occasions, but in some more fundamental transformation of bearing and expression. The woman looking back at her had shadows in her eyes from pain experienced and survived, but also a new directness in her gaze that came from learning to value her own judgment rather than accepting other people's assessments as definitive truth. "You look magnificent," Cordelia said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. "Not like a bride preparing to fulfill someone else's expectations, but like a woman who knows her own worth and isn't afraid to claim her rightful place in the world. Marcus Blackwood is going to regret his choices the moment he sees you, though his regret changes nothing about the fact that you're better off without someone capable of such cruelty." Sebastian arrived precisely on time, resplendent in formal evening wear that emphasized his continental sophistication and his lean athletic build, and when he bowed over Penelope's hand, his eyes held unmistakable admiration that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. "You're breathtaking," he said simply, "and I'm the most fortunate man in London tonight to have you on my arm." The Harrington ball was exactly as grand as Penelope remembered from previous years. Hundreds of guests in their finest attire, musicians playing from a gallery above the ballroom, refreshments laid out with artistic precision in the dining rooms adjacent to the main gathering spaces. Penelope entered on Sebastian's arm with her head high and her expression carefully composed, and she felt the wave of attention that followed her progress through the room as people recognized her, and immediately began whispering speculation about her appearance and her escort, and what her presence at this ball might signify about her recovery from the wedding day scandal. She spotted Marcus almost immediately, standing near the orchestra with a petite blonde woman who must be his new duchess, and Penelope felt her stomach clench at the sight of them together, looking perfectly matched and appropriately coupled in ways that she and Marcus had never quite achieved during their engagement. But then Sebastian's hand tightened reassuringly on her arm, and he leaned close to murmur, "You're doing beautifully. Breathe, and remember that his choices say nothing about you." They made their way through the receiving line, Penelope greeting the Countess of Harrington with polite composure and deflecting the older woman's obvious curiosity about her relationship with Prince Sebastian through carefully vague responses that confirmed nothing while suggesting interesting. And then they were moving into the ballroom itself, and Penelope knew the moment when Marcus saw her because his expression shifted from polite social pleasantness to something that looked uncomfortably like shock, followed rapidly by what might have been regret. He crossed the ballroom toward her with clear intention, his new duchess trailing slightly behind, with an uncertain expression that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with her husband approaching his former fiancée in such a public setting. "Miss Ashworth," Marcus said with a bow that was technically correct, but which carried undertones of discomfort that Penelope found grimly satisfying. "I'm surprised to see you here tonight. I had understood you were still in seclusion following the conclusion of our engagement." "I was never in seclusion," Penelope replied evenly, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Simply taking time to recover from a difficult experience and to reassess my priorities and my future now that my previously determined path has been so thoroughly disrupted. But I'm quite well now, Your Grace, and looking forward, rather than dwelling on past disappointment." Marcus's gaze shifted to Sebastian with obvious assessment and what might have been jealousy. "Prince Volkov," he said, his tone cooling noticeably. "I wasn't aware you were acquainted with Miss Ashworth." "We met through mutual friends several months ago," Sebastian replied with a kind of easy confidence that came from genuinely not caring about Marcus's opinion or his judgment. "And I've found Miss Ashworth's company remarkably stimulating intellectually. She's far more interesting than most of the people one encounters in English society, who seem to value conformity and superficial accomplishment over genuine engagement with ideas." The implicit criticism made Marcus's jaw tighten visibly. "Indeed," he said stiffly. "Well, I'm glad to see you've found companionship that suits your particular temperament, Miss Ashworth. I wish you every happiness in your future endeavours, whatever they may prove to be." "And I wish you happiness in your marriage, Your Grace," Penelope replied, then turned to address the blonde woman who had been hovering nervously throughout this exchange. "Duchess, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Penelope Ashworth, and this is Prince Sebastian Volkov of Austria. I hope you're finding English society welcoming as you settle into your new position." The young Duchess, she couldn't have been more than 19, looked relieved at this gracious overture. "Thank you, Miss Ashworth. That's very kind of you, especially given the circumstances. I understand the situation was difficult for everyone involved, and I want you to know that I wish you no ill will." "Nor I you," Penelope said honestly, recognizing that this girl bore no responsibility for Marcus's choices or his cruelty. "I hope you'll be very happy at Thornhill. It's a beautiful estate, and I'm sure you'll make an excellent duchess." Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable as this exchange proceeded with more grace than he apparently expected, and he made his excuses quickly, drawing his duchess away toward a group of his political associates with obvious relief at escaping the awkwardness. Penelope watched them go and realized with sudden clarity that she felt nothing, not anger, not longing, not even the bitter satisfaction she'd anticipated from witnessing his discomfort. He was simply a man who had made choices that hurt her, but which had ultimately freed her from a future that would have been a prison, and his happiness or unhappiness with those choices was no longer relevant to her own life or her own possibilities. "How do you feel?" Sebastian asked quietly, his hand warm and steady against her back. "Free," Penelope said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I thought seeing him would hurt, would make me question myself or doubt my value all over again. But instead, I just feel grateful that he rejected me, that I was spared from spending my life bound to someone who never saw me as anything beyond a contractual obligation. I'm free, Sebastian, free to choose my own future rather than accepting one that was determined before I was born. And that's worth all the pain and humiliation of that horrible day, because without it I would never have discovered who I actually am when I'm not performing for someone else's expectations." Sebastian's expression held such warmth and admiration that Penelope felt tears gathering despite her best efforts at maintaining composure. "Then dance with me," he said, offering his hand. "Not because convention requires it, or because we're fulfilling some social obligation, but because I want to hold you and celebrate your freedom and demonstrate to everyone in this ballroom that you've not only survived your scandal, but you've emerged from it stronger and more authentically yourself than you've ever been." They moved onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and as Sebastian's arms settled around her waist and they began to move together in perfect synchronization, Penelope felt something settling in her chest. Not quite healing, because some wounds leave permanent marks regardless of how well we recover from them, but perhaps the recognition that transformation was possible, that devastation could be survived and even converted into opportunities for becoming someone more complete than the carefully constructed performance that had preceded the breaking. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly, looking up into Sebastian's face and seeing genuine love looking back at her. "Ready for what?" he asked, though his smile suggested he already knew what she was about to say. "Ready to build a future with you," Penelope replied. "Not because you're rescuing me from scandal or because I need someone to restore my social position, but because I genuinely care for you and I believe we could create something meaningful together based on mutual respect and authentic partnership. I'm ready to choose you, Sebastian, the same way you've been choosing me every day through consistent demonstration that you value who I actually am rather than who I was trained to become." Sebastian stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the floor with hundreds of people watching, and he pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made Penelope's breath catch and her heart race. When he finally released her, the ballroom had erupted into whispers and exclamations, but Penelope found she didn't care about the gossip or the scandal, or what anyone thought about this public display of affection from an Austrian prince toward a woman who had been publicly rejected at the altar just months earlier. "I love you," Sebastian said simply, his voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby couples would absolutely hear and spread the declaration throughout London before morning. "And I would be honored to marry you if you'll have me, honored to build a life with you based on genuine partnership and mutual choice rather than arranged convenience. Will you marry me, Penelope? Not because your father negotiated an alliance or because society expects it, but because you actually want to spend your life with someone who sees your value and celebrates your strength." "Yes," Penelope said, laughing through tears that were transforming her vision into something wavering and uncertain, but beautiful nonetheless. "Yes, I'll marry you. And this time, I'm choosing for myself rather than accepting what was chosen for me, and that makes all the difference." They finished the waltz to scattered applause and considerable speculation, and when Penelope looked across the ballroom and caught Marcus watching them with an expression that might have been regret, or possibly just discomfort, she felt only pity for him and gratitude that his cruelty had freed her from a future that would have been a slow suffocation of everything she was capable of becoming. She had been promised from birth to be a duchess, trained her entire life to fulfill a role that had been assigned without her consent. But Marcus's rejection had given her the opportunity to discover who she actually was when she wasn't performing for someone else's expectations, And the woman she'd become through that discovery was far more interesting than the carefully constructed performance that had preceded the breaking. She would marry Sebastian and move to Austria and build a life based on genuine partnership and intellectual compatibility, and she would be happy in ways she'd never been allowed to imagine during all those years of preparation for a future that had been determined before she'd had any say in its shape. And someday, perhaps, she would thank Marcus for his cruelty, for freeing her from a prison she hadn't even recognized as confinement until the door had been forced open and she'd been pushed through it into possibilities she'd never been permitted to consider. But tonight, dancing with the man she'd chosen for herself, rather than accepting the man who had been chosen for her, Penelope felt only gratitude for the transformation that devastation had made, and hope for a future that belonged entirely to her, rather than to the expectations that had bound her since before her first breath.